Murder waits behind a velvet mask. Welcome to Detective's Diary. I am your host Wyatt. Drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in, city or countryside. Thanks for making us part of your mystery nights. Now, the case begins. If there's one thing guaranteed to make Nero Wolfe narrow his eyes over a forkful of sauced calf's brain, it's the phrase exclusive membership. Second only to that is personal favor, and when both were delivered before lunch, I knew I wasn't going to get my usual afternoon to reorganize the orchid invoices in peace. The man who brought the message looked like he'd been airbrushed out of a 36 ad for private yachts, pocket square, silver cufflinks, and a haircut that probably had its own monogram. He introduced himself as Quentin Vale, vice chairman of something that sounded like it ran better without sunlight. I realize this is irregular, he said, glancing at the leather chairs like they might be booby-trapped, but the matter is, well, sensitive. We were told Mr. Wolfe occasionally makes exceptions for cases of, shall we say, delicacy. Mr. Wolfe makes exceptions for truffles and rare vintages, I told him. You'd have more luck with a bottle of Court and Charlemagne than you will with hush-hush talk and silk socks. But go on. You've already got the floor. He did. And he used it like a man who knew the price of silence. Vale was a founding member of the Montclaire Club, a society so private it didn't show up in telephone directories, tax filings, or police reports. Located in a converted brownstone on East 71st, it catered to men who liked their secrets framed in mahogany. One of those men, Ellis Waldron, had recently resigned from the club. 2 days later, he'd been found collapsed in the lobby of his apartment building, clutching a velvet box and mumbling something about a mask and betrayal. The press called it a heart attack. Vale, shifting uncomfortably, thought otherwise. What makes you think it wasn't? I asked. He was 48, athletic, and had no history of heart disease. And more to the point, he'd just told me he was going to expose something at our next meeting. He said someone in the club had been playing a long con. Wolfe, who had remained as still as an overfed statue for the entire delivery, finally spoke. A long con, Mr. Vale, he said, without looking up from his buttered corn cake. A term regrettably modern. You believe Mr. Waldron was eliminated for threatening to reveal it? Vale hesitated. I think he died under circumstances designed to appear ordinary. I don't know how or by whom. But I do know he left a sealed note addressed to me. It's gone. Gone? From his desk drawer. Along with a mask. A mask, Wolfe echoed. What sort of mask? A theatrical one. Venetian. Gold trim, crimson detail. He claimed it was connected to the person he suspected. Wolfe put down his fork, a gesture that in our household meant one of two things: either he was about to unleash an indictment of culinary laziness, or he had decided, very reluctantly, to engage with the outside world. I dislike clubs, Mr. Vale, he said. They are sanctuaries for dullness and pretension, occasionally masquerading as prestige. However, I abhor theft, particularly when it follows threat and precedes death. Then you'll take the case? Vale's eyebrows rose like he'd just spotted sunlight through a bank vault. I will consider it, Wolfe said, closing his eyes. Archie. Show Mr. Vale out. Then cancel dinner. We have to think. I'll say this for Wolfe. When he decides to think, it's not an activity, it's a siege. And judging by the way he was already rubbing his forehead and muttering about masks and betrayal, I figured we were about to be neck-deep in men with secrets, schemes with layers, and the kind of logic that starts with a stolen note and ends with a public unmasking. I've seen it before. And it never ends quietly. When Wolfe says he needs to think, he doesn't mean what you or I mean. For him, it involves an internal set of operations that makes a slide rule look impulsive. I've seen him outmaneuver a corporate attorney, a mob fixer, and a double PhD in logic all before lunch and do it without leaving his chair. But when it came to Quentin Vale's tale of missing notes, masks, and mysterious heart attacks, even Wolfe required an adjustment period. For my part, I spent the next 2 hours doing what I usually do when Wolfe goes into cerebral lockdown. I reread my shorthand from the visit, made a few phone calls to check the legitimacy of our new client, and considered whether this particular game of cloak and dagger would pay enough to replace the armchair Wolfe had ruined last month by refusing to acknowledge gravity. By 3:30, he had yet to speak. Not a word. Just sat there in the office, his eyes half-lidded, index fingers tented like they were bracing for a sermon. I walked in, holding a file from Fred Durkin. Fred confirmed Waldron had no real medical history, I said. Clean as a whistle. He wasn't on any prescriptions, didn't smoke, and barely drank. Neighbors say he jogged every morning at 6 and kept a record player that only spun Mozart. Wolfe didn't blink. And, I continued, I spoke to Waldron's doorman. Guy remembered him coming home late the night before he croaked. Said he looked distracted. Not drunk. Just preoccupied. Had a package under his armored ribbon, square shape. That one landed. Wolfe opened his eyes. Red ribbon? Yep. Was it recovered? Not that anyone's reported. Nothing on the inventory from the apartment. Just the usual wallet, watch, keys. No velvet box, no mask, no package. Wolfe growled. It wasn't a loud sound, more like a father reacting to a B-grade soufflé, but in Wolfe's world it translated to rage. Archie, you must make the following notations in your log, he said, sitting upright. 1. The mask, if not a diversion, is symbolic. 2. The theft of the note implies internal access if someone knew it existed. 3. Waldron's threat to expose something suggests premeditation. And most importantly, the involvement of that club. He said club the way most men say rat. You don't like the Montclaire crowd, I said. They are not a crowd, Wolfe corrected me. They are a funnel. A gathering of men whose wealth permits delusions of invulnerability. That, I detest. Wealth is permissible. Arrogance without merit, intolerable. Which told me he wasn't just intrigued, he was already building walls in his mind, sectioning off theories, connecting dots only he could see. The doorbell rang at 344. Fritz had just delivered my sandwich, and I hadn't even unwrapped it. I opened the door to find a woman in a charcoal gray trench coat and matching gloves. Her hair was black and pinned back severely, with a look that said Wall Street, but her posture screamed she'd rather be anywhere else. I'm here to speak to Mr. Wolfe, she said, her voice crisp. He's expecting me. That was news to me. I'm Archie Goodwin, I said. Gatekeeper, guide, and occasionally therapist. Your name? Celeste Markham. Now that hit a memory nerve. I stepped aside and motioned her in. Wolfe's voice called from the office. Bring her, Archie. So he had been expecting her. She walked like she was trying not to touch the furniture, and took a seat across from Wolfe without being asked. That was rare. Most people wait for some kind of signal before they dare land in one of our chairs. She was either too distracted to care or used to rooms that bent for her. "You were a colleague of Mr. Waldron," Wolfe said, bypassing introductions. "I was his assistant," she replied. "Until last month." "Voluntary resignation?" "No. He let me go." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. I could hear the inner ledger adjusting its numbers. "Why?" Celeste hesitated. "He said he was reorganizing his private affairs. I assumed he was consolidating investments or prepping for a move. But he also started canceling meetings. Withdrew from the Montclaire Club. Told me to delete his calendar for the entire following week. That was 4 days before he died." "And you've come here," Wolfe said, "because?" "Because he asked me to," she said simply. "In a voicemail. Left the night before he died. He said, and I quote, 'If anything happens, go to Nero Wolfe. Tell him I was followed. And tell him I found the proof. The mask is real.'" Wolfe blinked, very slowly. Then he turned to me. "Archie. Get Sol." "Ah, the Sol card." When Wolfe wants something watched, followed, or surgically peeled apart from 50 paces, Sol Panzer is the man he calls. That meant this thing had graduated from minor curiosity to imminent disruption. "I assume, Miss Markham," Wolfe said, "you do not have the message itself?" She opened her purse and retrieved a phone. It was saved to the cloud. "Here." Wolfe didn't reach for it. He gestured for me to take it. I played the voicemail twice. Waldron's voice was breathless, fast, clipped like a man who knew time had become a variable. "If you're hearing this, it's because I pushed too far," he said. "Celeste goes to Wolfe. Show him the club's annual. The mask's not just a symbol. I found out who wears it. And why." The line cut there. I looked at her. "Annual? I don't have it," she said. "But I know who might." Wolfe leaned back. "Names, Miss Markham." 3. All Montclaire members. All had reasons to dislike Waldron. She pulled out a slip of paper. Wolfe took it with a pair of brass tongs he kept on the desk for moments just like this. Anthony Draycott. Chair of Membership. He opposed Ellis's exit. Laura Bingham, Events Coordinator. She's the one who handled the Masquerade. And Victor Massey. Finance Committee. He had dealings with Ellis. Quiet ones. Wolfe murmured. A masquerade. Naturally. He closed his eyes again. "Archie, schedule interviews with each. I will not move. But I will listen." "And Celeste, was Ellis in love with you?" That made her blink. "No." Wolfe opened his eyes. "But he trusted you. Deeply. That is rarer than love." She said nothing, which in my book was the closest thing to agreement. When she left, Wolfe stared at the door long after it had closed. "The masquerade," he muttered again. Not a metaphor. Not merely a costume. A mechanism. A cover. Concealment for something more enduring. He turned to me. "This is no longer about a death, Archie. It's about who believes they can murder truth and bury it beneath ritual. That offends me." And that was Wolfe in a nutshell. You could burn down a building and he'd yawn but lie with structure, and he'd declare war. I grabbed my notebook and coat. We had 3 suspects to visit. And Wolfe had just declared the brownstone open for battle. When I think of clubs, I think of gin, linen, and men who never learned how to hang up their own coats. The Montclair, as it turns out, was all that and a side of something stickier. I didn't get past the lobby. The place wasn't designed for welcome mats, and they certainly weren't rolling one out for a guy who didn't arrive in a Bentley or with a board seat in his back pocket. But I didn't need to sit on their velvet chairs. My job was to talk, watch, and remember. And Wolfe, from his fortified post back at the brownstone, was already lining up his chess pieces. The suspects, he'd said, would not yet realize they were suspects. That, he claimed, was our tactical advantage. I started with Anthony Draycott. He worked out of an office suite near Park and 60th Mahogany Doors, a secretary who wore tailored calm like a perfume, and a nameplate that read Draycott, Member Relations. That told me two things. 1, he liked his title vaguely. 2, he liked it spelled in gold. He met me in a room that smelled like oiled wood and generational wealth. Mid-50s, smooth jawline, and a handshake that managed to be both limp and condescending. "You're from the press?" he asked, without smiling. "Close. I'm from Nero Wolfe." That got a reaction. Not fear is more like curiosity with a splash of inconvenience. "I see. I've heard of Mr. Wolfe. The detective who refuses to stand. You've been well briefed. Why is he concerned with Montclair?" I took a seat without asking. "Because one of your members died, and left breadcrumbs that led directly to your club. We're trying to make sense of them." "Ellis Waldron," he said, folding his hands. "A pity. He was bright, if a touch melodramatic." "You didn't like him." "I didn't not like him. But he had a way of treating the Montclair like a stage instead of a sanctuary. He wanted to change things." "What kind of things?" Draycott's lips pulled tight. "The club is built on discretion." He wanted transparency. Votes, minutes, accessible financial records. He had ideas. "And you blocked them?" He gave a small shrug. "The membership committee found them unpalatable. We are, by design, selective." "Selective enough to kill for it?" He blinked. Once. Then smiled. "You're charmingly blunt, Mr. Goodwin. But no. Ellis's passing was tragic, not criminal. And frankly, I'm surprised Wolfe's wasting his time." I didn't reply. I was too busy watching his fingers tapping on the armrest like they had something to confess. He walked me to the door with all the warmth of a tax audit. As I turned to leave, he added, "If Wolfe truly wants answers, he should talk to Victor Massey. He and Waldron had entanglements." Entanglements. Always a fine word when the speaker doesn't want to say money. Next stop, Victor Massey. His office was on the Upper West Side, stacked with antique ledgers and smelling faintly of Turkish tobacco. Massey greeted me with a distracted nod and kept fiddling with his tie the entire time we spoke. He was younger than Draycott, mid-40s maybe, with a twitchy intellect and the kind of nervous energy that made you wonder if the floor was about to collapse. He offered me tea, then forgot to pour it. Ellis and I weren't friends, he admitted. We were partners, in a limited sense. He financed a few quiet ventures through the club's discretionary fund. But then he started asking questions. Too many. What kind of ventures? Philanthropic ones, nominally. Educational events, speaker series, scholarships. But Ellis had a fondness for details. He started requesting itemized budgets, wanting to review disbursements. Which you didn't like? I didn't mind. But others did. The club operates on trust. Digging too deep felt disruptive. Disruptive enough to silence him? Massey stiffened. Is that what Wolfe thinks? I'm not here to tell you what Wolfe thinks. If I knew, I'd be richer. I'm here to figure out whether Waldron's sudden collapse was natural or convenient. Massey leaned back, eyes flicking to a framed photo on the wall. It was of a masquerade man in suits and masks, standing around a ballroom with eerie symmetry. Last year's winter masque, he said, catching me staring. It's the club's most exclusive event. No press, no phones. Just a ceremony. Was Waldron at the last one? He was. And he caused a stir. What kind of stir? He showed up late, unannounced. Claimed to have proof that someone in the room had misused club funds. He never said who. Just held up a crimson mask and said, "The truth wears rouge tonight." Then he left. That sounds like more than a stir. Massey nodded. He liked theatrics. I think he was bluffing. Or he wasn't, I said. Massey went quiet. I took my leave, pocketing the image of that photo the way the masked men stood in fixed positions, like chess pieces awaiting a player's move. The last on my list is Laura Bingham. She was harder to pin down. Her office didn't exist. She didn't answer calls. But after 2 hours and a favor from Saul, I tracked her to an art gallery on West 25th private showing, wine served in crystal, and laughter that had too much echo. Laura was tall, elegant, and walked like she already knew what you were going to say. She wore black silk and a scent that reminded me of ink and ash. "You're Wolfe's man," she said, without turning. "That's me." I was wondering how long it would take. To find you? To circle back to me. Ellis was many things, but predictable wasn't one of them. You ran the masquerade. I designed it. Every mask, every room, every movement. It was meant to be symbolic. Themes of anonymity, rebirth, confession. Ellis used it as a pulpit. He accused someone. He alluded. Never named names. He knew better. Who do you think he meant? She studied painting, something abstract and blood-colored. He never told me. But he asked for a duplicate of one mask. Crimson, gold trim. The same as the one worn by someone on the finance committee. Victor Massey? She didn't answer. Did he tell you why? He said he wanted it for protection. Said the real mask would expose the real thief. That mask is missing now. I assumed it would be. You think he was killed? She turned, finally looking at me. I think Ellis played with fire. And in our circles, that rarely ends well. That was the first moment I felt that pulse Wolfe always talks about. The one that beats behind the lie. I thanked her and stepped into the fading afternoon light. 3 suspects. All well-groomed. All hiding something. And one red mask real or symbolic at the center of it all. I made my way back to the brownstone, where Wolfe would be waiting, stomach full, eyes closed, and mind already 5 moves ahead. We had suspects now. We had secrets. Next came the digging. And Wolfe, bless him, had just picked up his spade. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the sun had slipped behind the rooftops, and Fritz was floating around the kitchen like a silent magician preparing dinner for one hungry genius and one overworked field operative. The house smelled like mushroom consommé, and I could hear the faint creak of Wolfe's chair as I stepped into the office. He was in full bloom, arms folded, lips pursed, and eyes narrowed in that contemplative scowl he saves for situations that involve lying millionaires and symbolic accessories. "Well?" he asked, without looking up. "They're all hiding something," I said, sliding into my chair. "But if you want me to rank them by shoddiness, Massey gets the blue ribbon. He's nervous, fidgety, and trying very hard not to be remembered." "Explain," Wolfe said. I gave him the rundown: Draycott's aristocratic indifference, Massey's cracked composure, and Laura Bingham's gallery appearance, which had all the warmth of a confession wrapped in velvet. I included every detail of what they said, what they didn't, how their eyes moved when I mentioned the mask, and who pointed fingers at them. Wolfe absorbed it all without a single note. "You said Massey had a photograph of the Masquerade? Framed and centered on his wall. Could be a prop, or could be guilty in a tuxedo." Wolfe's eyes flicked open. "I want it. Or rather, I want a copy. If the mask Waldron mentioned was identical to one worn by a member that night, the photo might provide corroboration." I nodded. "I'll take Fred with me tomorrow." Massey didn't strike me as the kind to hand over evidence voluntarily. "We may need charm or the threat of charm." "Bah! Charm." Wolfe dismissed the word like it was a spillage on his rug. "Did Saul report back?" I asked. "He did. Mr. Panzer informs me that Waldron made several cash withdrawals over the last month. Small, consistent, totaling nearly $15,000. No documentation as to purpose." "Blackmail?" I asked. "Unlikely," Wolfe said. "Too methodical. More likely, preparation. An effort to distance a transaction from scrutiny." I leaned forward. "So, he found something, or someone. Paid for it off the books." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "And we are to discover what or who." The next morning, I dressed for business casual with a side of surveillance and headed out. My first stop was back at Massey's office, this time with Fred Durkin parked outside in case I needed a less delicate touch. I walked in with a box of pastries and a warm smile, the kind that opens doors and loosens paper clips. Massey looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was crooked, and his eyes were red at the edges. "Mr. Goodwin," he said with a half-hearted lift of his chin, "back so soon?" "Couldn't stay away," I said. "You've got the most photogenic wall art I've seen this side of the Guggenheim." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "That photo," I said, gesturing toward the Masquerade shot. "Would you mind if I took a quick snapshot? Mr. Wolfe is a man of details. Might help him visualize the layout." Massey hesitated. "Why?" "Because someone wore a crimson mask that night. And Ellis Waldron thought that mask was more than a party trick. He thought it hid something worth dying over." The room tightened. "I'll take a photo," I said, pulling out my phone. "Or I can go get a subpoena." "Your call." He didn't answer, just nodded and turned away. I snapped 3 shots wide, medium, and 1 tight on the group at the center of the room. I thanked him, left the pastries behind, and stepped out. Fred was waiting by a newsstand. "Get it?" he asked. "Got it," I said. "Now let's see if Wolfe can spot the devil hiding in the details." We drove straight to Saul's rented flat, where he had something lined up for us. The cash trail ends at a storage facility in Long Island City, Saul said as he let us in. Rented under an alias, but tied to Waldron's business address through a billing error. Unit 47B. I haven't gone in yet. Smart, I said. Let's take a look. The facility was clean, anonymous, and guarded by a clerk who barely looked up as we passed. We unlocked the unit and stepped into a room the size of a Manhattan bathroom. Inside a filing cabinet, a cardboard banker's box, and something covered in a blue velvet cloth. Fred pulled the cloth off. Beneath it sat a wooden mannequin head. One interesting thing was a crimson and gold Venetian mask. Well, Fred said, either we've joined a secret opera company, or we've found our prop. Take photos, I told Saul. Careful. Don't smudge anything. We opened the banker's box next. Inside were 3 manila folders, each with a name: Massey, Draycott, Bingham. The folders were thick transaction records, correspondence, receipts, handwritten notes. Waldron had been building a file. What is this? Fred asked, flipping through Bingham's folder. Looks like Waldron was putting together a case, I said. Tracing funds, connections, possibly favors traded inside the club. This wasn't curiosity. This was documentation. I called Wolfe the moment we stepped out. He answered with a grunt. Waldron was assembling a file, I said. Massey, Draycott, Bingham, each one has a folder. And we found the mask. There was silence. Then bring everything. We spent the next 3 hours back at the brownstone, arranging evidence like a pop-up museum. Wolfe didn't speak for a full 20 minutes. He moved only his eyes, his fingers occasionally tapping the edge of his chair's arm like a slow metronome. These are not just files, he said finally. They are instruments of leverage. Waldron was preparing to expose or coerce. And the masquerade was his stage. I nodded. You think he planned to unmask someone that night? Perhaps. Or perhaps he intended to bait a reaction. To confirm a theory. A performance, designed to provoke. And he paid for it with his life. Possibly. But not yet provable. Wolfe leaned back. We are close, Archie. Very close. But something is missing. A link? I asked. No. A movement. A rearrangement. The detail that proves intention. He closed his eyes. That mask was not merely symbolic, he murmured. It was placement. Who wore it? When? Why? Find the answer to that and we find the murderer. He didn't need to say more. The next move was mine. Tomorrow, I'll return to Montclair. But this time, not for tea. This time, I'd see who was trying hardest to stay hidden in plain sight. In Wolfe's world, movement is not to be mistaken for progress. That lesson had been hammered into me over 100 cases and at least 36 lectures. The man who flails, he'd say, moves water but doesn't swim. So when he said something was missing, a movement, a rearrangement, I knew better than to assume he was talking about motive. He meant detail. Physical, perceptible, deliberate. And detail was my job. The next morning, I set out with a copy of the Masquerade photo tucked in a folder, a fresh notebook in my coat pocket, and a vague idea that I might need to bluff my way into one of the most secretive clubs in Manhattan. Montclair didn't allow casual visits, but it also didn't like scandals, which meant they might prefer a quiet conversation over a public one. I wasn't expecting a warm welcome, and I didn't get one. The same receptionist was at the desk. Her nameplate said Marcy, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Draycott isn't taking visitors today." "That's all right," I said, settling into a chair across from her. "I'm not here to see him." "Then whom?" "I'm here to return something." That earned me a raised brow. I opened the folder just enough to show a sliver of the photograph. She glanced, then sat back like she'd been pinched. "Wait here," she said. I waited. 15 minutes, 2 hushed phone calls, and 1 watery cup of coffee later, I was shown into a meeting room with dark curtains and a long table that looked like it had hosted more secrets than a confessional booth. Laura Bingham was already there. She didn't smile. "I told you, Mr. Goodwin. I design masks, not alibis." I slid the photo across the table. "Then help me with this. The crimson mask. Who wore it at the last winter mask?" She studied it carefully. "That one," she said, tapping a figure at the edge of the frame. "That's Anthony Draycott. He always chooses red. Says it signifies leadership." "And the mask Ellis Waldron asked you to duplicate?" "The same one." I leaned back. That means Waldron was sending a message. Whoever wore that mask was his target. Laura's jaw tightened. "He never told me why." "Maybe he didn't need to," I said. "Maybe he thought just wearing the mask was enough to expose the wearer." She exhaled. "He was playing a game he didn't understand." "You think Draycott had him killed?" She didn't answer. Which, as usual, was all the answer I needed. Before I could press further, a sound interrupted the quiet clatter of something falling in the hallway. A shadow moved past the frosted glass of the door. Someone had been listening. I opened the door fast, catching just the back of a tailored blazer turning the corner. I stepped into the hallway and followed. No sign. But on the carpet, near the baseboard, lay a small object. A cufflink. Gold, monogrammed with the letter D, Draycott. Back at the brownstone, I laid out the photo, the cufflink, and the new information for Wolfe like a waiter presenting the chef with ingredients. He examined each with his usual disdainful thoroughness. "So," he said finally, "Draycott listens at the doors." "Or arrange for someone to," I said. "But he dropped that cufflink himself." "I'd bet my lunch." "You already have," Wolfe replied. "Fritz informs me you missed it." Again. I didn't argue. Wolfe turned his attention to the photo. "There's a discrepancy," he murmured. He pointed to the group at the center of the frame. "You see this space? An unusual gap. The men are posed deliberately, yet here, one is off balance." I looked closer. Wolfe was right. One figure, masked in silver and standing just behind Draycott, was a half step out of line with the others. An oddity. Not random. A subtle movement. "Who is that?" I asked. "Archie," Wolfe said, "is our ghost. The man who wasn't meant to be seen." I tapped the photo. "You think Waldron noticed?" "I think he noticed everything. And whoever that is, he wasn't supposed to be in the photo. Waldron had this printed, catalogued. Perhaps as leverage. And now?" "Now," Wolfe said, "we bait him." That night, under Wolfe's direction, I made a few calls, one to a discreet acquaintance at a small newspaper, another to a friend at a gallery that had hosted Montclaire events. We drafted a quiet inquiry, just enough to let it slip that Waldron had left behind a sealed envelope marked for the press, allegedly with names. We didn't say which names. We didn't need to. The next morning, our phone rang at 7:12 a.m. Fritz answered, then handed it to me with an eyebrow raised so high it nearly met his hairline. "Mr. Goodwin," said a voice I recognized as Victor Massey, tight and rasping. "We need to talk. Now. In person. Privately." "Why?" "There's something missing." "What?" "My apartment was entered last night. They didn't take anything valuable. Just a file folder. One labeled Waldron." I held the receiver, quiet. "That file was in your office," I said. "Yes," he admitted. "But I took it home. I thought it might be used against me." "Was it?" There was a pause. "Not yet." I glanced at Wolfe, who was now watching me like a cat watches a mouse it's decided not to eat yet. "I'll come to you," I told Massey. "Sit tight. Don't talk to anyone else." He hung up without a goodbye. "Another trespass," Wolfe murmured. "Not bold, not noisy. A subtraction." He turned toward the dining room, but stopped in the doorway. "Archie. The man in silver. Find him. Any tips?" "Yes. He's the one who isn't panicking yet." It was classic Wolfe logic. In a room full of the anxious and the guilty, the calm man was the one who already knew what had been done. As I reached for my coat, Wolfe called out, "And Archie, be discreet. We are nearing the endgame, and I'd prefer not to announce it." "Understood," I said. "But for the record, I'd still prefer a case that doesn't involve masks and club rituals." "You prefer cases with chorus girls and liquor licenses. Only on weekends." He didn't smile, but he looked like he might. Out the door I went. We had a missing file, a red mask, and a man who stood one step out of line. Now it was time to find out who had rearranged the pieces and why. Victor Massey lived in a madrisse on the east side, the kind of place with a concierge who asked more questions than he answered and elevators that smelled like old money and lemon oil. I rode up to the 9th floor with a folder under my arm and Wolfe's last sentence echoing in my head. "The calm man is the one who already knows." Massey wasn't calm. When he opened the door, his tie was gone, his sleeves were rolled up, and there were 2 empty coffee cups on the kitchen counter. One had lipstick on the rim. That didn't match the Victor Massey I knew, the careful one, the one who weighed every sentence like it was made of silver. He looked at me like a man expecting to be handcuffed or shot, and wasn't quite sure which he preferred. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The apartment was tasteful in that way only decorators and men with money can manage. Soft light, leather chairs, abstract art with titles no one could pronounce. But something was off. A drawer was half open. A plant had been knocked over. And there were no folders in sight. "I didn't tell anyone I had the Waldron file," Massey said, pouring himself what looked like his 5th cup of coffee. "But someone knew. They came in through the service door. Didn't take anything else. Just the folder. And they were too careful. They knew exactly what they were after." "Any security?" I asked. "No cameras. I keep the place private." "Big mistake." He nodded slowly. "I know. I paced the room while he talked. No forced entry. No sign of a struggle. Just one absence that meant everything. That folder had held Waldron's own notes on Massey notes we hadn't had time to read. That meant someone else now had them. And Massey wasn't sure whether that made him more or less of a target. "Do you think it was Draycott?" I asked. He hesitated. "Draycott doesn't take risks. He delegates them. If it was him, someone else wore the gloves." I believed him. For once, he didn't have the poise to lie. "I think," Massey continued, "that someone wants to bury Waldron's trail. Not just cover it, erase it." That wasn't news. But hearing it said out loud changed the tone. I left Massey stewing in his paranoia and headed straight for the brownstone. Wolfe was finishing lunch when I arrived, and from the look of the plate, it had involved scallops and at least 2 sauces I couldn't pronounce. He wiped his mouth with the precision of a surgeon. "Well?" "Somebody hit Massey's apartment," I said. "Clean job. Just took the file on him. No other damage." And Victor didn't know whether to call the police or his therapist. Wolfe made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a sigh. "They're tightening the circle," he said. "Which means we're closer than they expected." He turned to me. "Where is Saul?" "Working as a contact," I said. One of his guys on the club's maintenance staff flagged something odd. Wolfe nodded, satisfied. "Celeste Markham has not returned my call," he said. "Which is regrettable. I'd hoped she could confirm Waldron's full file structure." "Think she's scared off?" "Possibly. Or possibly neutralized." The word hung in the air like a cold wind. We didn't have to wait long for more news. At 4:06 p.m. Saul walked in, rain on his coat and a look in his eye that told me this day wasn't about to get simpler. "I spoke to a night porter at Montclaire," Saul said. "Quiet type. Works the lower floors. Said he was ordered to dispose of some boxes yesterday morning. Office stationery, mostly. But one of them had Waldron's handwriting on it." Wolfe stiffened. "Where is this porter?" "Off duty until tonight. But I've arranged a meeting." "Good," Wolfe said. "Anything else?" Saul nodded. "He mentioned something strange. Said he'd seen someone in the club's archive room late at night. Not a member. Said the guy wore gloves and used a duplicate key." "Did he see a face?" "No. Just a gray suit. But he swears the man took something from the cabinet marked M Special Events." I exchanged a glance with Wolfe. "M as in Masquerade?" Wolfe closed his eyes. "This confirms it," he said quietly. The Masquerade was not merely backdrop. It was an archive. Waldron knew the truth was embedded in that night, perhaps in the symbolism, or in the documentation itself. And someone is determined to ensure it stays buried. "Who's the someone?" I asked. Wolfe didn't answer. He was too deep in his own orbit. The phone rang. Fritz picked it up in the hall, then appeared in the doorway with a worried look. "It's Miss Markham," he said. "She's at a diner near Columbus Circle. She sounds afraid." I grabbed my coat. The rain had started to fall in sheets by the time I got there. The diner was nearly empty, just a few tourists hunched over coffee and a waitress who looked like she hadn't had a day off since the war. Celeste sat in the back booth, hunched over a cup of tea like it was a lifeline. She looked up as I approached, her eyes red. "Thanks for coming," she said. "I didn't know who else to call." "You did fine," I said, sliding in across from her. "What happened?" "They followed me," she whispered. "2 nights ago. Black car, tinted windows. I lost them after a few turns, but then someone broke into my apartment. I didn't press her. She'd get there in her own time. They didn't take anything," she continued. "Just rearranged my desk drawers, my bookshelf, my closet." "That's not burglary," I said. "That's a message." She nodded. "They wanted me to know they'd been there." I leaned in. "Celeste, what was in the Waldron file you helped him build?" She hesitated. "Names," she said. "Dates. Mask assignments. Waldron tracked every costume at last year's masquerade. He thought the masks were used to signal something of an internal alliance. He believed certain members used the event to negotiate favors." "And who was wearing crimson?" She looked up. "Draycott. But that wasn't the only one. There was a silver mask worn by someone who wasn't on the guest list." Wolfe had been right. "Do you know who it was?" I asked. Celeste shook her head. "Ellis thought he'd figured it out. But he wouldn't tell me the name. He said he needed to be sure." I slid her a photo from my folder. "Is this the man?" She stared at it. "Yes. That's him. The man who shouldn't have been there. Do you know who he is?" "No," she said. But Ellis had circled him in the original print. He wrote one word in the margin: leverage. That was all I needed. I paid for her tea and told her to stay somewhere else for the night. Quiet, away from her apartment. She nodded. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely afraid. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was already in the office, eyes closed, fingers interlocked. "She confirmed it," I said. "The silver mask. Not a guest. Waldron thought he was the key. Wrote down leverage." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Then it is time," he said. "Time for what?" "To call them all." He reached for the phone. "We summoned the masquerade," he said, "one last time." And just like that, Wolfe was no longer in analysis mode. He was moving the pieces into place. By the time dawn broke over the city's copper rooftops, Nero Wolfe had already begun positioning his dominoes. Not that he moved, of course. Wolfe didn't reposition furniture, let alone himself. But make no mistake, every file in the cabinet, every chair in the office, and every suspect being summoned into that room had been placed with the same precision he used to trim his orchids. He was orchestrating confrontation the way some men compose sonatas. The calls went out early. I handled them personally. Draycott, Massey, and Bingham were each contacted with the same firm but vague invitation: Mr. Wolfe would like a word regarding the legacy of Mr. Ellis Waldron. I used just enough mystery to pique, and just enough finality to make refusal feel like a mistake. They all agreed to come. Curiosity, guilt, fear, it didn't matter. The car was still coming to the same address. "What's the order?" I asked Wolfe as I crossed back into the office with a fresh notebook in hand. "Draycott first. He's the center. He believes himself composed. We will exploit that belief. And Massey? After. His anxiety will ferment while he waits. And Bingham? Last. She is observant. I want her to listen to the other two before she speaks. Wolfe steepled his fingers and stared at the chairs I'd already placed in the office. One directly in front of his desk, two more to the right. The lighting had been adjusted soft, but direct on the faces. Fritz had even prepared a tray of chilled water, though I doubted anyone would be drinking much. At 11 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Draycott arrived with a silk scarf, a gloved handshake, and an expression halfway between amusement and irritation. "I do hope this won't take long," he said. "I've a luncheon with the Civic Arts Committee." "Mr. Wolfe won't keep you," I said. "Unless you give him a reason." He entered like a man who owned his surroundings, even when he didn't. Wolfe didn't rise, of course. He inclined his head slightly, as if Draycott were a delivery and not a guest. "Please," Wolfe said. "Sit." Draycott did, crossing his legs neatly, the scarf trailing like punctuation. "You know why I've asked you here," Wolfe said, voice low and even. "I can speculate," Draycott replied. "It involves Ellis Waldron. And, I presume, the Montclaire Club." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "What do you know about the Crimson Mask?" Draycott chuckled. "A costume. Nothing more." "And the man who wore it?" "You're looking at him." "Good. And the silver mask?" Draycott's eyes flicked for the first time. "I wouldn't know. We don't catalog mask choices. It's a tradition, not a bureaucracy." "Waldron did," I said. "Catalog them. Assign names, times, positions. He believed the masks were more than decoration." Draycott shrugged. Ellis had a flair for the dramatic. Perhaps he found a mystery where there was none. "Perhaps," Wolfe said. "And yet someone entered his apartment after his death. Removed files. Followed his assistant. Removed a second folder from Victor Massey's apartment." Draycott's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting what? That I orchestrated a burglary to remove a file about myself?" "I'm suggesting," Wolfe said calmly, "that someone feared exposure. And that fear turned into action." Draycott uncrossed his legs. "If you had proof of such a thing, I doubt we'd be conversing." "No," Wolfe agreed. "But I have leverage. As Waldron put it." Draycott's fingers twitched once. Then he stood. "I'll wait outside," he said. "If you have more, you know how to find me." "Indeed," Wolfe said. Massey arrived 10 minutes later, nerves walking 2 steps ahead of him. He looked like he hadn't slept, and smelled like coffee had replaced his bloodstream. "You invited Draycott too?" he asked before even sitting down. Wolfe gestured for him to be seated. "I invited everyone relevant," he said. "You are all, after all, bound by the same thread." Massey sat. "Mr. Massey," Wolfe began, "you had dealings with Ellis Waldron. Financial, obscure, and shall we say unofficial. He tracked those dealings. Attempted to frame them within the context of club allegiances, symbolized by mask and presence." "Yes," Massey said, his voice faint. "He told me he suspected a hidden cabal. Said the masks were identifiers." "And you believed him?" "No. But I believe him now." "Why?" "Because someone broke into my home," Massey said. "And took the file I didn't tell anyone I had. That doesn't happen unless something in that file mattered." Wolfe allowed a silence to stretch out before answering. "You're correct," he said. something did matter. Waldron identified someone at the masquerade wearing a silver mask. A man not on the guest list. A man placed deliberately near you and Draycott in the photograph. Massey paled. Who? We're not yet certain. But we believe that man is the key to Waldron's death. Massey rubbed his face with both hands. I knew something was wrong. I should have come sooner. Perhaps, Wolfe said. But now, you'll remain. I'll wait outside, Massey said, rising. And thank you. Laura Bingham arrived 15 minutes later. She entered in silence, her posture straighter than I'd seen it before, and her eyes sharper. Miss Bingham, Wolfe said. You understand why you've been summoned. I suspect I do. You assisted in the planning of the masquerade. You crafted the masks. You knew the placement. She nodded. Yes. Who wore silver? Wolfe asked. I never knew his name, she said. He was a late addition. Brought in by Draycott, I believe. Said he was a guest from a sister club in Boston. But he never signed the register. Wolfe's brow lifted a fraction. And you didn't question that? I did, she said. But I was overruled. By Draycott? She nodded. Wolfe turned his gaze to me. Archie, fetch them. I stepped into the front hall and summoned Draycott and Massey. They entered side by side, avoiding eye contact with each other. Wolfe waited until they were seated. The man in the silver mask, Wolfe said, was no guest. He was a plant. Brought in to watch, to signal, perhaps to negotiate. Waldron saw him. Circled him in a photograph. Marked him as leverage. He turned to Draycott. Who was he? Draycott looked down at his gloves. No one is important, he said. Wolfe's voice hardened. Who? Draycott met his gaze. A lobbyist. Political fixer. Someone I consulted, briefly. Waldron saw him and misunderstood. Or perhaps understood too well. Why was he at the masquerade? Wolfe asked. To observe. That's all. And Waldron? He confronted me afterward. Said he had proof I'd brokered favors. Threatened to expose it. I didn't believe him. You're lying, Massey said suddenly. We all turned. You knew, Massey said. You always knew he had files. That's why you broke into my apartment. You wanted to know how much he'd documented. Draycott turned slowly. I did no such thing. You did, Massey said. Or someone working for you did. Wolfe raised a hand. This is not a trial. But we now understand the motive. Waldron had leverage. Someone removed it. He leaned back. Whether that removal was fatal remains to be seen. But the pattern is clear. The room was still. Wolfe closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he said, we will reconvene. With the police. Nobody argued. Outside, the rain had started again. Inside, Wolfe had reset the board. And tomorrow, the last piece will fall. It was the kind of gray morning that made Manhattan feel like it had forgotten how to blink. Mist clung to the windows like a second skin, and the street outside the brownstone lay hushed, as if the city itself was bracing for something. Inside, things were anything but still. Fritz polished the silver tray 3 times, Saul checked the locks and blinds, and Wolfe, though he hadn't moved a muscle, had clearly entered the final chamber of his mental labyrinth. The gathering was scheduled for 11 o'clock sharp. Wolfe had insisted on that. No drifting in, no rearranged appointments. His office wasn't a parlor, and today it wasn't even a place of business. It was a crucible. And Wolfe, seated at his desk with his bulk sunk deep into the custom chair that had witnessed more confessions than any priest, was about to apply heat. I had just set out the final glass of water when the bell rang. The guests arrived one by one, like actors stepping into a third act without knowing whether they were heroes or villains. Laura Bingham came first, quiet, composed, with a notebook tucked under one arm and eyes that didn't miss a thing. Victor Massey followed, pale and twitchy, carrying a nervous cough and an expression that belonged to someone who'd been chasing sleep for 3 days without success. Draycott was last, as I suspected he would be. Impeccably dressed, posture rigid, carrying himself like a man who could still bluff his way through customs with a forged passport and a confident smile. The only tell was his left hand, which he kept clenching and unclenching, fingers curling into his palm like he was holding something invisible and dangerous. They each took the chairs Wolfe had assigned them, arranged in a neat semicircle before his desk. No one spoke. Wolfe didn't greet them. He let the silence bloom, thick and deliberate. Then he began. "You are all here," he said, his voice low but clear, "because one man is dead, and his death was neither simple nor silent." Ellis Waldron attempted to illuminate a pattern. He did so through metaphor, record-keeping, and most notably, through the Masquerade. He paused. "I have no evidence that he was murdered. But I have every reason to believe that his death was catalyzed by fear held not by him, but by someone in this room." A twitch from Massey. A breath drawn and held by Bingham. Draycott remained statuesque. Waldron believed, Wolfe continued, that the Montclaire Club hosted more than social rituals. That the masks worn during the winter masque were not mere costuming, but identification tools of silent negotiation. He opened a folder and slid out a photograph. I recognized it as the high-resolution reprint of the Masquerade image, the one showing Draycott in crimson, Massey beside him, and the silver-masked man standing out of step with the others. He turned it toward the group. "This photograph," he said, "is not damning. But it is informative." The crimson-masked Draycott stood in the central position. A sign of rank. Waldron duplicated that mask. That, I believe, was a message. Draycott finally spoke. "So I wore a red mask. And the silver one," Wolfe said, "was worn by a man not on the guest list. Brought in quietly. By you." Draycott's jaw moved slightly, as if chewing a sour thought. "I explained this yesterday," he said. "The man was a guest." Briefly. "No," Wolfe said, his voice firm now. "He was a political liaison. A fixer. Not a member. He was placed near Massey during the Masquerade for a purpose. And Waldron saw it." He tapped the photograph. "Mr. Massey," he said, "do you deny financial ties that would be jeopardized by exposure?" "No," Massey muttered. "I didn't know what they were doing." "Not fully." "And you, Miss Bingham," Wolfe said, "you oversaw the masking. Yet allowed a man with no registration to enter your event. Why?" She looked at Draycott. Then back at Wolfe. "Because I was instructed to. And the person who instructed me controls access to funding I depend on. It wasn't a request, it was an order, disguised as a favor." Wolfe nodded slowly. Draycott, he said, used the masquerade as a vehicle. Waldron uncovered this. He began assembling proofs, assigning names to masks, intentions to appearances. He leaned back. Then Waldron died. His files vanished. One from his apartment. One from Massey's. His assistant followed, and her home entered. But nothing was taken, only rearranged. He paused. That is the detail that matters most. Rearrangement. Not removal. A signal, not a theft. He turned his gaze to Draycott, and for the first time, Wolfe's voice sharpened. You knew Waldron had compiled the names. But you didn't know how much. You feared what was in the files, but you also feared drawing attention. So you didn't destroy them immediately. You read them. You copied what you needed. Then you returned to take the original. Draycott said nothing. The trespass at Miss Markham's apartment, Wolfe continued, was not about intimidation, it was about confirming whether she had a copy. She didn't. You were fortunate. Still, Draycott didn't respond. But I saw it now, his jaw had tightened, and he'd stopped flexing that left hand. Wolfe lowered his gaze to the photo again. Waldron marked the silver mask with one word, he said. Leverage. I believe he intended to reveal it, to use the mask to expose a chain of influence, illegal or unethical, hidden beneath club rituals. He looked at each of them in turn. You all had motives to fear exposure. But only one had the power to arrange surveillance, to pressure silence, to orchestrate removal of evidence, and to do so without disturbing the surface. Wolfe raised his hand and pointed. To you, Mr. Draycott. The room held its breath. Draycott's smile was thin, cold. You have no proof, he said. No, Wolfe replied. But I have Miss Markham's voicemail. I have the files/copies of the originals. And I have your silence, which has told me more than words could. Draycott stood abruptly. This is a farce. No, Wolfe said. This is strategy. Yours has run out. I stepped between them. Wolfe never stood. He didn't need to. Laura Bingham spoke next, her voice low but clear. I'll testify, she said. If it comes to that. So will I, Massey added, shakily. Draycott looked at them both. His eyes were suddenly very tired. I never intended harm, he said. Just containment. Wolfe's brow rose. Containment, Mr. Draycott, is a coward's word for control. He pressed a button on his desk. A soft chime sounded. Fritz entered. You may show them out, Wolfe said. One by one, they filed out. Draycott last. He didn't speak again. When the door closed, Wolfe turned to me. Inspector Kramer will arrive shortly, he said. You'll give him the files. All of them. You're going to let the law finish this? Yes, Wolfe said. This isn't murder. Not provable. But it is manipulation. Blackmail. Possibly bribery. Kramer will find the rest. And us? We will eat, Wolfe said. And forget the masks. But I knew better. Wolfe never forgot anything. Especially not who wore what, and why. Inspector Kramer arrived with his usual perfume of cigar smoke and poorly concealed skepticism. He didn't knock. He never knocks. He stormed into the brownstone with the impatience of a man who's been summoned to a chess match after the checkmate. He took one look at Wolfe and started in. "You drag me out here, Wolfe, and tell me there's something I need to see, better be good. Because I've got 2 burglaries and a judge breathing down my neck about a sealed indictment." Wolfe, seated like a continent in his chair, simply gestured toward the tray on the desk. "There are files," he said. 3, to be exact. Copies of documents compiled by Ellis Waldron prior to his death. They indicate systemic misuse of private influence through the Montclaire Club, or at least abetted, by a man named Anthony Draycott. Kramer's mustache twitched. "Misuse of influence isn't a crime." "No," Wolfe said, "but bribery, forgery, and racketeering are." That made Kramer pause. He looked at me. "What's he got, Goodwin?" "Enough to make a DA sweat," I said. "And enough for you to get a search warrant for Montclaire's private records." We believe Draycott used the Masquerade as a cover for off-the-books dealings with the help of a fixer he smuggled in under a mask. Kramer raised an eyebrow. "You think Waldron found out and paid the price?" Wolfe stirred slightly in his chair. "No. I think Waldron got scared. He attempted to expose it, but in a way that retained his own leverage. That leverage made him a target not for murder, perhaps, but for silence. Permanent silence, if it came to it." Kramer crossed the room and opened one of the files. The top page was a ledger money moved from one account to another, tied to obscure foundations and donations routed through shell organizations. The next page showed correspondence/emails, printed and annotated by hand, linking masked identities to real names. "Hell," he muttered. "Yes," Wolfe said. "Hell, but well dressed." Kramer took the whole stack, bundled it under his arm. "Anyone in custody?" "Not yet," I said. "But Draycott won't run. Men like him never do. He believes the rules won't apply until someone in a darker suit tells him they do." Kramer snorted. "You still love the sound of your own voice, Goodwin. I have good material." Kramer turned to go, then paused. "What about death? Any way to prove it wasn't natural?" Wolfe shook his head. "None I can find. But the circumstances surrounding unexplained symptoms, missing items, multiple entries into his home afterward should justify further inquiry." Kramer left with a nod. And just like that, the official arm of the law took over. That should have been the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. 3 days later, we got a call. Celeste Markham. She'd returned to her apartment and found a package slipped under the door, no address, no postage. Inside a second crimson mask. Identical to the one Draycott wore at the Masquerade. No note. Just the mask, laid flat in a manila envelope. She came straight to us. "It's a warning," she said. "Or a message. I don't know which." Wolfe took the mask with a handkerchief and set it on the edge of his desk. He stared at it for a long time. "Symbolic," he said finally. "But also possessive. Whoever sent it knew you were involved in Waldron's work." "You think it's Draycott?" she asked. "No," Wolfe said. "He has no reason to threaten you now. The machinery is in motion. He's not foolish enough to compound his troubles." "Then who?" "A partner," Wolfe murmured. "Or someone further up the chain." He tapped his fingers. "There may be more to the Masquerade than even Waldron understood." I leaned forward. You think the fixer wasn't the end point? No, Wolfe said. He was the deliverer-man, not the client. Celeste looked pale. So it doesn't end with Draycott? Nothing ever does, Wolfe said. Not in rooms full of masks. We kept the mask. Stored it in an evidence envelope, labeled and sealed. Fritz wasn't thrilled about sharing space in the brownstone, but Wolfe insisted it stay visible, close, and unforgettable. A week passed. Draycott was arrested. Charges pending. Massey and Bingham gave statements. The Montclaire Club froze its operations pending investigation. And the press? They called it a scandal. Society masquerade tied to political backdoor deals, the headlines read. But none of them knew about the man in the silver mask. None of them knew what Wolfe suspected, that someone in that room had been more than a guest. More than a facilitator. Someone had been the real buyer. The one Waldron had marked with that word. Leverage. Wolfe didn't say it aloud. He didn't have to. One night, over duck à l'orange and a delicate Alsatian Riesling, he finally spoke. Archie, he said, do you recall what Waldron said in his final voicemail? Something about masks, betrayal, and proof. Yes, Wolfe said. But specifically, he said the truth wears rouge tonight. Draycott's mask. Possibly, Wolfe said. Or possibly he meant it metaphorically. Rouge. Concealment. Makeup. I stared. You think Waldron wasn't pointing at Draycott? I think Waldron realized too late that his focus was misdirected. He took a sip of wine. There is a difference between a man who wears the mask and the one who commissions it. It made sense in the way that all of Wolfe's deductions eventually dislike a curtain falling after a long play. Clean, precise, devastating. And so the brownstone settled back into its rhythm. Fritz resumed his culinary rituals. Wolfe returned to his orchids and books. And I finally caught up on paperwork that had been threatening to rebel. But the crimson mask remained in the file drawer. Not as evidence. As a reminder. Of Ellis Waldron, and the game he thought he understood. Of the man in silver, whose name we never learned. And of Wolfe's final judgment, not spoken to a courtroom, not penned in ink, but murmured over duck and wine, like the truth was a dinner guest we hadn't expected. The masquerade, Wolfe had said, was not an event. It was a mirror. And everyone wore what they were too afraid to say. That was the end of it. For now. The brownstone breathes differently after a case concludes. There's a weight that lifts, subtle but perceptible, like when a long spell of rain ends and the streets still glisten but no longer drip. Wolfe doesn't declare a case finished. He simply returns to routine. That's how you know. He withdraws into his orchids, takes his meals without commentary, and lets the silence resume its rule over the rooms. That's where we are now. Draycott had been arraigned. Kramer was busy digging into the files we'd provided, building a case that would stretch beyond headlines and into hearings. Massey had gone conveniently quiet, no doubt working through legal counsel on a strategy that involved survival rather than defense. Laura Bingham had disappeared from public view, her gallery shuttered for renovation. And Celeste Markham had taken Wolfe's advice to leave the city for now. Somewhere quiet, she said. Somewhere with fewer masks. And Wolfe? He hadn't left his chair in days. The crimson mask still sat in its sealed envelope in the corner drawer. Fritz refused to let it into the pantry and had even threatened to burn sage in the house. I told him if he lit anything near Wolfe's desk, he'd end up as the next file in our archives under F for Fritz, former cook. That calmed him down. I stepped into the office one afternoon around 4 o'clock, a time when Wolfe was usually deep into his third book of the day and his second bottle of beer. "You'll be glad to know," I said, "that the Montclaire Club has officially dissolved its board. The statement went out this morning. They're calling it a temporary restructuring due to internal review. Which, as euphemisms go, is about as subtle as a brick through a stained glass window." Wolfe didn't look up from his copy of the Gazette. "I will not be glad," he said. "Montclair was a monument to false order. Good riddance." "You think it's over?" I asked. "For them," he replied. "Not for the man in the silver mask." I took a seat. "You still think he was the key?" "I know he was," Wolfe said. Waldron's final note, his choice of words, the way he structured his evidence, everything pointed to someone beyond Draycott. Someone who let Draycott carry out the work, but who pulled the true strings. "We never found him because we never looked far enough up." "And you're content with that?" He folded his paper with excruciating care. "No. But Kramer has what he needs. Draycott will answer for enough crimes to satisfy the legal appetite. The rest will wait." That was Wolfe's way of saying it was unfinished business shelved, not dismissed. I leaned back, arms folded. "So that's it. Waldron's gone. Draycott's on the hook. Massey will turn state's evidence. And the real operator in silver walks." "Not walks," Wolfe said. "Lingers." There was something in his voice dry, distant, like a warning whispered into a storm. I shifted the topic. "Fritz wants to know when he can burn that envelope." "He may not," Wolfe replied. "Why not?" "We've got scans. It's not admissible in court." "It is a symbol," Wolfe said, "of unfinished truth. I would see it before me, until I decide I have seen enough." I didn't argue. I rarely do when he uses phrases like that. Dinner that evening was a saddle of lamb in rosemary reduction, accompanied by pommes dauphinoise and a chilled bottle of Sauvignon Blanc. Wolfe ate with gusto, in that methodical way he always did, slow, deliberate, reverent. Halfway through, he broke the silence. "You did well, Archie." "Well, sure," I said. I arranged an interrogation, traced 3 suspects, handled press calls, smoothed over a terrified witness, and managed to not punch Massey in the nose. "Yes," Wolfe said, swallowing. "And you saw what Waldron feared." I didn't reply right away. He wasn't being rhetorical. "You mean the man in the silver mask?" "No," Wolfe said, setting down his fork. "I mean the principle. The idea that influence wears a smile, a tuxedo, and a glass of champagne and still strangles what it must, if it feels exposed." I took a sip of wine. "You always get philosophical after Lamb." He ignored that. "Waldron," Wolfe continued, "believed he could play their game and win. That documentation and leverage would protect him. He was wrong. Not because he lacked intelligence but because he still believed the structure had rules. And it didn't." "No," Wolfe said. "It had customs. And men like Draycott know how to exploit custom without ever breaking a rule." That hung in the air for a moment. Then Wolfe nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Enough," he said. "We will not speak of them again." Which meant, of course, that we would. Later, when the case resurfaced in some obscure connection or when another man in another mask showed up in some other room claiming to represent something benign. That's how Wolfe operates. He archives everything. Not just in drawers or filing cabinets but in that massive, infuriating brain of his. After dinner, we returned to the office. I poured coffee. Wolfe lit a cigar. Outside, the streetlights flickered on like stage lights in an empty theater. I cleared my throat. "There's something I didn't tell you," I said. Wolfe looked up. When I escorted Celeste to the cab she said something odd. "Go on." She said Waldron had a phrase he used. Back when he was preparing the files. Said it more than once. What was it? "The mask isn't what hides the truth," she said. "It's what lets the lie walk free." Wolfe inhaled. Then exhaled. A long, steady breath of smoke. Then he understood, he said softly. Too late. But he understood. I watched him for a moment. "You think the man in silver will come back?" "He never left," Wolfe said. And that was the final word. I finished my coffee. Wolfe returned to his chair. And the brownstone, as always, returned to silence. The crimson mask stayed locked away. But in Wolfe's world, no door stays shut forever. And no masquerade goes unremembered.